We're here today because we thought we would take you through web accessibility and review. Being December, we wanted to review what's positive, what has been not so positive, and also as a way to kind of kick things off, we'd be curious, what some of your accessibility accomplishments of challenges have been in 2022. Feel free to either share those in the chat directly or in the Q&A if you want to keep it more anonymous. But as you're sharing those, we'll also go through some quick housekeeping. Please feel free to use the live transcription from Zoom. Of course, being focused on accessibility, that's always important. We'll have this closed captioned. And then also, we will be sending the recording and the slides. So if anybody does need to jump early, you'll be able to review this at your leisure. And then, as we mentioned before, we encourage all questions of all kinds. So please feel free to put them in the Q&A panel. If you're unfamiliar where that is going to be down below in the panel next to the left of the chat. And then we'll take them at the end of the session as well. So as I briefly mentioned, for those that are joining us now, my name is Megan Locke. I'm the Demand Generation Manager for Civic Plus. And then I'll also like to introduce Ashley to introduce herself as well, and who's joining me. And then after she's finished, we will also have Jasmine introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Hefner, and I'm the marketing coordinator with Moncito, powered by Civic Plus. Really excited to have you all here today for this webinar and take a look back at 2022 and all that's happened. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass it on over to Jasmine to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jasmine de Guzman. I am the Director of International Marketing here at Moncito, powered by Civic Plus. Super excited to see so many of you joining us live today. I think web accessibility this year has been a topic that we've touched on time and time again, and it just goes to show how important it is. It's so fantastic to see so many of you joining us here live today. So really excited to kind of wrap up the year with you and set you up for success in 2023.
Excellent. Welcome, ladies. Looking forward to really reviewing what we've done as far as accessibility for the last year. But I know a number of you are also very interested in understanding what exactly Civic Plus is. We were mentioning before, Moncito is now part of the Civic Plus family. And high-level overview of what we do, we're a leader in the government technology or GovTech industry with a full product suite focusing on creating a positive civic experience. So if we pull out all of those amazing buzzwords, which us marketers love, we really provide software solutions to local government, including things like websites, mass notifications, agenda and meeting management, and we bring it all together so that we make it easier for those that work in Gov to communicate with their residents and vice versa. So as far as today's agenda goes, as we mentioned, we're going to be reviewing the state of web accessibility. As far as 2022 goes, which it still blows my mind that we have come to the end of it, but really taking an overview of significant updates throughout the year, and as well as looking at predictions around web accessibility for 2023, and then finish up with Q&A, which is personally one of my favorite parts, and I'm sure it's Jasmine and Ashley's as well, because we actually get to hear from you. So without further ado, I will pass things off.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Megan, for that introduction. And I know we have a lot of amazing Moncito Gov customers probably on the line, maybe some prospects. But we've also, I know, got a lot of other fantastic customers on the line as well. And we're so happy that you're joining us here today. So as you know, on a Moncito webinar, we do love to kick it off with a quick pulse check. So I'm going to launch this in just a second. And what we really wanted to find out today is, how has the accessibility of your website progressed in 2022? So have you maybe made more progress than expected? A big clap for you. We're going to meet the goals that you set. I think it's so important that you as a team are setting goals, and tracking those key performance indicators when it comes to accessibility. If you didn't quite achieve your goals, you know what, that's also okay. You are working to address it, and that's fantastic. The first step is getting your foot in the door and making sure that you're making progress. And if you haven't started yet, you know what? Welcome. You're in the right place. You're here to learn, and that's fantastic. And we applaud you and encourage you for doing that. And if you have another comment, feel free to drop it in the chat. As Megan said, we'd love to engage with you and see what different people's challenges are. And I can already see from the question earlier that Megan posed, some of the challenges that people have had are getting staff and faculty to only host and share accessible PDFs is an ongoing struggle. Trust me, I work in marketing. We manage our website. I feel you. We have a very strict policy of having a couple different gatekeepers of who's posting PDFs on the website to make sure that that's not happening. Another story that I'll just read out here while we're finishing up the poll is that a person shared a positive, and that is that the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction has a huge eye-open on equity practices. So yes, digital equity, I think, is one of the things we've heard accessibility being addressed under that umbrella term this year, which is very exciting. And then of course, needs work. I need to increase my understanding of how to apply these practices on web pages. Absolutely, that's fantastic. And I can see there's some other people agreeing as well. So we're all in the same boat. We're all working together towards the same goal. So it's great to see so many people here today to share their knowledge. With that, I'm just going to close out the poll and share the results as well. So very interesting, about 19% of you have made more progress than expected. That's fantastic. It inspires the rest of us because it goes to show that it's actually achievable. And same for those 27% of you who are going to meet the goals that you've set. Please share all your tips. We want to know how you're getting there. And for those of you who didn't quite achieve your goals, well, you know, December, as we're rounding out the year, it is the perfect time for you to set new goals for the new year and maybe roll some of those over. And again, 16% of you haven't quite started yet. So we got a good mix of a group here. Welcome. If this is your first introduction to website accessibility, we really welcome you and again, applaud you for taking the first step in the right direction, because it is something that is so incredibly important from an inclusion standpoint, and it can really make a difference in a lot of people's lives. So I'm very excited to have you here today and share with you a little bit about what's been going on this past year in the accessibility space. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Ashley to walk us through the year in review.
Thanks, Jasmine. So as Jasmine mentioned here, we are going to go through the state of web accessibility in 2022. I think Megan also mentioned that it's crazy to think that we're approaching 2023. The year sure does fly by fast, but a lot has happened with accessibility. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the things that have happened. So one of the ways that we're going to take a look here is we pulled some headlines from different articles that have came out. And so we'll just go year by year in review and kind of talk about some of those. So in January, government testing identifies accessibility issues on 99% of public sector websites. So this really shows that the government was looking at websites closer and finding issues representing a potential problem for users with physical or cognitive disabilities, impairments, I should say, excuse me. And they held a government research exercise where they monitored levels of compliance with new rules, and they tested 593 websites. So this article was a good one that we thought to highlight, as well as confusion follows 11th Circuit decision in seminal ADA website case, vacating its prior ruling in favor of Winn-Dixie based on mootness. So that was a case that we thought was very interesting to highlight as well. In February, 3 years after Ontario Accessibility Report, little progress made, former Lieutenant Governor says. So with this, AODA, they were looking to, release new rules, and 3 years after, little progress had been made. So they were really taking a look there to say, what can we do to progress this more? And then also in February, the International Association of Accessibility Professionals came out with overlay position and recommendations, where they were stating that, overlays are more of a quick fix rather than getting to the root of the issue here and creating, something universal for all. And then in March, Justice Department issued web accessibility guidance under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the Department of Justice, they did come out with some basic info about ADA requirements, but no new info really for legal practitioners. So this was kind of just the start of getting the conversation going. As well as in March, Winn-Dixie saga finally concludes in Florida. 181 advocacy groups urged the Department of Justice to issue website accessibility regulations. So you can just see the progression there from January to March with that case. And then in April, as we're moving along here, circuit courts split on standing to sue an ADA Title III website accessibility claim. So the split on the standing was the Title III of the American with Disabilities Act. So the two circuits basically arrived at opposite conclusions, and that's what that article talks about. In May, a report came out, according to the Valuable 500, that 54% of companies have an active disability, and we need to start incorporating some inclusion accessibility policies. So that's where you see this article report. 33% of orgs don't have a digital focus on accessibility. So with that, I thought something interesting in the article was that persons with disabilities, they make up an estimated of 1.3 billion people. So that's a large, amount of our population, yet we are still facing some discriminations for the article. So that was interesting there. And then in June, senators asked Department of Justice to enforce accessibility rules for state and local websites. A group of 10 Democratic senators asked the Department of Justice to ensure that websites and other digital services offered by state and local governments that they're complying with ADA. So this was also, just seeing that progression with the Department of Justice and people standing up and asking for more clear-cut regulations. And in June, Robles versus Domino's settles after 6 years of litigation. So this was a case where Domino's was actually sued for their website not being accessible. And this just goes to show that, when your website isn't accessible, if it does get taken to litigation, it can be a very long process. 6 years is a long time. The Department of Justice also failed to report on making federal websites accessible to disabled people. So once again, we see the Department of Justice, becoming more active with this and more information coming about their stance. Thank you. And then in July, the New York Times released an article discussing how artificial intelligence powered tools may be an easy fix for us as a company. We buy the tool, we put it into our website, and it can be the best way to fix accessibility, some people think. However, blind people or people with disabilities are actually finding that it makes the website harder to use. So we thought that was very great to highlight here and something to keep in mind. In August, Justice Department to issue first ever rules on web accessibility under ADA. So once again, we see that they're starting to establish more rules, taking it more seriously, and understanding that the Accessibility Disabilities Act, does need to be considered for digital real estate. Another one here was Casey leads bipartisan letter to government watchdog urging examination of lack of web accessibility across federal government. So once again, this is an article where we see the federal government talking about a lack of web accessibility. California Court of Appeals rules that UNRU doesn't cover websites of purely online companies. So once again, just talking about how we need to progress our online accessibility. In September, what's new in digital equity? Lawmakers urge action on accessibility. So this was an article that came out by govtech.com where they wrote an article on digital equity. And what this really did was it brought light to the fact that not all of us have access, not all of the population has access to high-speed internet, right? Not everyone's broadband internet service is the same. So digital equity is something that is a hot new topic because it's very important to understand. Thank you. And in October, proposed web and software accessibility legislation introduced in the United States Congress. So taking this to the Congress level, on September 28, 2002, the Websites and Software Applications Accessibility Act was introduced, and this was in both the US Senate and the United States House of Representatives. So really great progress to see that there, as well as showing that, hey, it's being introduced and talked about across the board. Another article here in October, websites that violate disability laws squeeze for financial settlements. So just another reminder here that they do sometimes go to litigation. It can be costly. And this article kind of talked about the financial repercussions and how sometimes it's a little too late to start to be motivated to make your website accessible. In November, the DOJ promises to resume filing federal website accessibility reports. So, that article is kind of as it is, where you can see that the plan comes again after months of talking and these requests being made that the Department of Justice take a stance. And so that was an interesting article we figured to highlight here for November. And then in December, which is our current month, where you can see that so much has already happened in the year and things are still continuing to come out. The Justice Department, launches new Americans with Disability Act website. So it's an actual place where you can go and visit to see, some of these new regulations, things that are being put out, and what conversations are being had around ADA compliance. And yeah, with that kind of wraps up everything from January to December. I'm sure, we have 3 weeks left in December, more will happen. But we do want to go ahead and move on and talk about some key web accessibility takeaways from 2022. So after we take all that, we want to wrap it up and talk about some things that will be, golden nuggets to take with you in this next year. Number one is more awareness amongst government. So more action from senators and awareness around the lack of accessibility on local and federal government websites. So as I talked about in some of those articles, you can see how more and more government officials are becoming more involved in this as we bring awareness to its importance. Number two is continued legal confusion. Split circuit courts are differing rulings, makes for a confusing legal scene when it comes to web accessibility. So really nothing clear cut being come from that because people aren't really coming to one conclusion. So just seeing that it's going to be a continued legal battle and mainly being aware of that so that you can continue to keep up with the new rulemakings as they come out, making sure your website's accessible. The Department of Justice is fishing for rulemaking. So number three would be new guidance plus their proposed rulemaking sets the scene for definitive answers in 2023. So just keep an eye out for some new rulemakings coming out, and hopefully they'll take more of a official stance, and we'll be able to report that back to you probably in 2023 in one of our webinars there. So stay tuned. But those are just some of the 3 key takeaways that we wanted to leave you with.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ashley. And in case anyone missed it as well, all of the articles that Ashley talked about and mentioned, we have them in an appendix at the end of the slide deck, and we're going to distribute the slide deck afterwards as well. So if you're interested in digging into any of those articles a little bit more, all those links will be made available to you afterwards because there's so much to dig into. There's so much to unpack. And just as Ashley highlighted, there's so much that's been happening this past year in the web accessibility space. So what I'm going to jump into now is touching on some of the things that Ashley has mentioned and just talking about their significance, just because, yes, it's good to look at them. They've been in the headlines. They're big news, but I really want to jump in and unpack them a little bit. And I also want to look at what they mean in terms of future expectations. What does it mean next year? What does it mean going forward? I also see there's some great questions in the chat, so keep them coming. Please feel free to also use the Q&A if you want, just so that we can keep an eye on all of them and they don't get lost in the chat. But the first thing I wanted to talk about was WCAG 2.2. Ashley and I actually did a very similar webinar to this one last year in December. And one of the big kind of thoughts and predictions that we had for 2022 was the release of WCAG 2.2 being imminent. And for those of you who are not familiar with website accessibility, and this is a new topic for you, the WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And these are global, internationally recognized standards for website and digital accessibility. Currently, the latest version is WCAG 2.1, but a new version, WCAG 2.2, was initially set to be released earlier this year, and then it was delayed, I believe, until the summertime, and now and then it was delayed until December. So we were very excited, and we actually even hosted a webinar last month with one of our accessibility experts in preparation for it, and it has now been announced that it has been delayed to early 2023. There's a couple of key reasons behind this as well. So the WCAG guidelines are published by the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, as you'll often hear them referenced as, and they are working with volunteers on a volunteer basis, putting these guidelines together with input from people all around the world. So that is also one of the main reasons why it's been delayed. But we did do a deep dive into it in our last webinar. So if you haven't seen it, I definitely recommend you to check it out. But just to give you a little bit of overview, it introduces WCAG 2.2 introduces 9 new accessibility checks, and they're really focusing on not necessarily your typical challenges, for example, with a screen reader for blind individuals, for example, but focusing on things with cognitive or learning disabilities, users with low vision, and people navigating on devices. And just to give you a couple of examples, because for me, they were these improvements and these new checks are going to make a big difference, not only for users who do have cognitive disabilities or low vision. I think they're going to make a big change and impact for all of us. One of the checks that they're implementing is that you do not need to put in repetitive information. And I wish you guys were all standing in front of me, because I'd say, how many of you have ever ordered something online? I think we'd all raise our hands and say, yes, yes, I can see some people raising their hands. And how many of you have ever had to put in both your billing address and then right afterwards have to put in your shipping address? That is a challenge. Yes, exactly. I think everyone's experienced that. That is a challenge for someone with cognitive disabilities. So one of the important improvements for WCAG 2.2 is that you should only have to input that information once. So for example, you put it in as your billing address, and then there might be a checkbox beneath it saying, please also use as my shipping address. And I was like clapping when I heard that, because I was like, that's fantastic. That is just goes to show that a great user experience also means great accessibility. One of the other things that I also thought was particularly amazing and exciting about WCAG 2.2's upcoming and pending release is something for users with low vision, but it's also for me in combination for people who are often using mobile devices. My grandfather has a neurological disease, and it's very difficult for him to press buttons, for example. So his preferred method of accessing the internet is a tablet, his iPad. But one of his challenges, because of his motor skills with his neurological disease, is pressing tiny buttons on websites that are too small in their pixels. And so that is something that is going to be a requirement, is that anything that you need to press on a mobile device, for example, needs to be of a certain pixel size to help people, for example, with motor skill disabilities. Just to give you as well an update, if you're not sure which level you're compliant with now, I definitely recommend that you go out and find out. You should also find out there's different states or different industries that have different levels that they need to comply with. Typically, your laws or regulations in your state or state will refer to one of the WCAG levels, but we do always recommend that you try to comply with the newest possible version, just because if you are compliant with 2.1, you're also compliant with 2.0. And if you're already working to achieve towards 2.2, you'll also be compliant with 2.1. A little fun fact for anyone who's already a Moncito user out there, we have already released a draft version of 2.2 in our tool, so you can already scan your website for it today. I hope that gave you guys a little bit of insight on WCAG 2.2, which was supposed to be released this year, but it's also something very much for the future. Do keep a lookout for it. We will, of course, also make sure to inform you when it is released, and we will also make sure that our tool is updated with the latest version when that is available. Another point I'd love to talk about, so I'm going to continue to talk about WCAG, is 3.0. So 3.0 is something you may or may not have heard of. It is another version, and it has already been announced. And yes, it's still in the works, even though 2.2 hasn't been released yet. So WCAG 3.0 will be a successor for 2.2. Originally, when they announced it last year, in 2021, the expectation was it would be done in 2023. At this point, it's looking like it'll more likely be in a couple of years from now, but the working draft is in progress. In fact, they have it out for commenting, I believe. But one of the really big differences with 3.0 versus 2.2 is that it will not be backwards compatible, but at the same time, it will not supersede 2.2. So I think that's an important point. And it is simply because there will be a lot of overlap, but there will also be other testing mechanisms with 3.0. So the prediction is just kind of that, or different organizations will prefer different, will choose to prefer using different versions. So some will choose to go the 3.0 route, some will try to achieve 2.2. We'll have to see. Who knows how it will work in practice. I think this is one of the first times the WCAGs won't be backwards compatible in the same way that we've been used to. What they have announced, though, which will probably give us all a little bit of peace of mind as we're working towards 2.2, is that if the content conforms to 2.2A or AA, it will at least meet the minimum conformance levels of 3.0 when it comes out. But there's a lot of things still in the works for this. So it's definitely something for you to keep an eye on in 2023, just because it could be something in the future that legislation could reference that you either need to be compliant with WCAG 3.0 or 2.2. We don't know yet, but it is something very interesting to follow in the accessibility space. All right, the state of web accessibility lawsuits. If you've joined us before, you know we've had our legal counsel, Jessica Youngs, join us before and give us updates, because the reality is there is a lot of legal action happening in the United States when it comes to website accessibility. Not as much in Canada, which I know some of you are also joining from. But nonetheless, it's an important consideration, especially if you're doing business in the States. So in 2021, there were about 2,300 website accessibility lawsuits filed. If you look at digital accessibility in a whole, so other types of digital assets, whether it be apps or one of those digital kiosks that you see at the airport, there were about 4,000 lawsuits filed in 2021. And that was really a record last year when that happened. And so as we were going into 2022, the predictions were just that the number of lawsuits was going to explode and continue to increase. But what was very interesting was that there was a mid-year review done and federal lawsuit filings had actually dropped. They dropped from being about 6,300 in 2021, halfway through the year, down to 4,900 in 2022. And I have a theory about this, and I'm curious to see if any of you guys also think that this could be one of the reasons. But I know in 2021, a lot of us were still at home. We're still not able to go out because of the pandemic. And so that was probably meaning that we were a lot more reliant on websites and online shopping. And so the discovery of these website accessibility issues was that much higher. Because the world's been opening up and society's been opening up, people are able to go in person and do things, and therefore website accessibility issues have not been as big of a problem because you've had options and alternatives to the online world. That was not necessarily the reality in 2020 and 2021. So I have a feeling that could be one of the reasons. Don't hold me to it, but I'm curious if anyone else also has had that gut feeling around it. When it comes to website accessibility lawsuits, and I'm going to jump and flip my last two bullet points around here, but New York and California have continued to be the top two states with filings. I've put the source here as well for all of this in case you want to check it out. Florida, which used to be up there with New York and California, the filings have really gone down this year, and that's because of the 11th Circuit Court split, saying that if you did not have a nexus, if you were just an online business, then you were not subject to websites as a public accommodation. So that's been a very interesting development there this year. It'll be interesting to see what happens with California now, especially with the Unruh Act, also kind of discussing some similar claims when it comes to whether or not an online only business is subject to the same rules as those with a physical nexus. And then the last thing was when it comes to website accessibility lawsuits is that we've seen more en masse targeting of industries. So I think it was in February, March, April, we basically saw the same plaintiff going after individual, or basically taking a list of vineyards in Napa Valley, for example, and going after every single one of them and suing them when it came to website accessibility. And we've seen similar things happen in other industries. And I just want to preface as well that this is not meant to scare you. It's just to inform you that website accessibility lawsuits are a real thing. It is something that's happening. It is a risk for your business or your organization. So I don't want to scare you. I really believe you should be tackling website accessibility because it's the right thing to do. But I think it's important that you're informed because there's a lot of very real consequences when it comes to web accessibility lawsuits. And with that, I also just wanted to jump into two of the really big cases that came to a close this year. And I know Ashley mentioned two of them, but the Domino's case, I think, is a really big one that has really dominated the web accessibility space for the past 6 years. And it all actually went all the way up to the Supreme Court, as Ashley mentioned before, where a blind individual had sued Domino's for lack of web accessibility, and actually, as Ashley mentioned, a lack of accessibility in their mobile application. So it was not accessible for this individual who's using screen readers, and he sued them for violating Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act, being that they were a private organization. This has been ongoing for 6 years, as Ashley mentioned, and we are not sure that we will ever know the outcome because they have confidentially settled that case. Maybe the files will be opened up at some point, but there's been 6 years of litigation. So you can imagine the cost for an organization like Domino's in battling that and also remediating their website and getting it up to WCAG standards. The Winn-Dixie case, this was in the 11th Circuit Court, as I mentioned before, where there's really been a lot of back and forth. So there, a blind individual sued Winn-Dixie because he or she could not refill their prescriptions using a screen reader. And the courts originally sided with the individual. It was thereafter overturned by the 11th Circuit Court, stating that websites are not a public accommodation. And this is really the biggest challenge in the website accessibility space, is whether or not websites are or not seen as a public accommodation. This is what is causing confusion, both among circuit courts, between federal and state governments, and so on. So it ended up being that there were appeals on both sides. It ended up, as Ashley's article previously mentioned, being dismissed as moot. But you see, even when it's getting dismissed, there are advocacy groups coming out hard, calling for the DOJ to issue clearer and stricter web accessibility regulations, just to avoid all of this confusion and understanding what is the right and what is the wrong when it comes to making sure that everyone is able to access your website and that it's an inclusive place. Because more and more, the website or websites have become a public accommodation, especially when if you, for example, are wheelchair bound or wheelchair in a wheelchair, for example, and are not able to, as freely as the rest of us, go out, then it's very nice that you have the convenience of ordering from home whatever you may need. So the last thing that I want to highlight is also something that kind of has come out of all of this confusion in the legal space, and it is, first of all, that the DOJ did announce new web accessibility guidance, as Ashley highlighted, in March. That was overwhelmingly in the accessibility community met with disappointment, actually. And I was initially very excited when I saw this come out. I was like, oh, this is great. This is fantastic. But unfortunately, what did not do is provide any clear guidance and regulations of how to enforce it. And this is always the difficulty with website accessibility. Guidance is great, but being able to enforce it from a regulatory perspective still is incredibly needed. The happy news is that in August, the DOJ did announce the notice of proposed rulemaking. So they're getting ready to hopefully propose some legislation. So that's something that definitely you need to keep an eye on next year. It is something that we think will likely impact, I think they've announced it for Title II, so public organizations first on the AD, but it is very, very much likely to have a spillover effect to Title III and private organizations going forward. So that will be very interesting to follow along with. And I'm sure there will be a lot of noise being made, especially as there have been bills introduced already this year to try to kind of speed up this process. And with that, we're going to take a look at some practical tips and inspiration for how your organization can stay on track. And I'm going to let Ashley kick it off.
All right. Thank you, Jasmine, for all that great information. And as Jasmine mentioned, we're going to go over some practical tips. Hope that you guys can keep these in your toolkit here and your arsenal and bring them out when they're needed. But practical tip number 1 for web accessibility in 2023 is sign up for a web accessibility course. So if you're here today, I think you're off to a great start because it means that you're interested in learning, you're willing to attend webinars. So kick off the new year by refreshing your web accessibility knowledge and encourage your colleagues to do the same. We always say that it's great to have a web accessibility champion in your organization, but how wonderful if there can be many of you. There are loads of free online courses. See slide 27 for free recommended web accessibility intro courses. So we will share those with you. And when you get the copy of the recording and the slides, feel free to reference back to those and sign up for some of those if you're interested. If you're a Moncito customer, schedule a free web accessibility refresher with our customer success team or join one of our free monthly accessibility trainings. We do have an IAP professional who does lead those accessibility trainings. She has a breadth of knowledge and always sharing new practical tips and ways to address accessibility in your organization, as well as our customer success team is always willing and able and happy to do so. Schedule some time with you to go through a refresher of what our platform does and how we can help you your website stay accessible. Practical tip number 2, web accessibility in 2023, we would say is stay up to date with changes in web accessibility. As we just went over, I recently shared all of those articles, right? That's a lot of changes that are happening. A lot of things are moving in this industry. So set up a Google alert specifically around web accessibility for your state or your province. Sign up for a web accessibility newsletter. That's my personal favorite because that's how I get a lot of information too. As marketers, we're always looking to stay up to date with what's happening, right? So that we can in turn educate our customer base. So some of those newsletters that we recommend are accessibility.com, MicroAssist Accessibility in the News, and Moncito's emails and newsletters. And just to talk on accessibility.com, they also do events throughout the year, which are really great learning opportunities too. So if you follow their newsletter, you can stay up to date with those and maybe sign up for some of those. Get inspired and follow web accessibility advocates on LinkedIn. In some slides coming up here further, I will share some as well as Jasmine of our favorites. So stay tuned for some of our personal inspirations, but definitely find those people on LinkedIn. They're constantly sharing new content and it's a great way to help yourself stay an advocate in your organization.
Awesome. Thanks, Ash. And I think we'll just highlight as well, we'll add links to these 3 different web accessibility newsletters before we distribute the deck so you guys can have easy access to sign up to them. So I'm going to tackle practical tip number 3, and it is aligning web accessibility with your other business goals. I think having web accessibility as a goal, as I mentioned before, is just the right thing to do, but sometimes it's a little bit more digestible to get your manager or your directors to approve it if you're tying it in with other benefits in your organization. If you are, for example, very concerned with SEO, maybe you're a digital marketer or communicator, or maybe you're just a local government agency that has Washington in your name and you want to make sure you're standing out from all the other Washington counties there are out there in the States, then SEO and accessibility do go hand in hand. So there's a lot of crossover benefit there. For example, making sure that you have alternative text on images is also something that's not only good for website accessibility and allows blind individuals to understand images through a screen reader, but also great for SEO. If you're working in a product team, for example, making sure that you're addressing website accessibility is also addressing user adoption and experience. And that's also something that's important for your website. A lot of good web accessibility practices are also good, just general user experience practices, as I mentioned before. And then, of course, if you have an HR department, inclusion and diversity is something that's not going away. I think as Generation Z moves into the workforce, it's going to be something that is even more valued and appreciated. So it's definitely something that you as an organization can perhaps partner with them. If you're tackling website accessibility, partner with your HR team to make sure that that is part of that overarching theme. And then, of course, if you are a B2C or B2B organization, having a lack of website accessibility accessibility can also negatively impact things like conversion rates. If I can't fill out my online order form because I have to type in my address twice, it might happen that I'm not going to convert, and therefore you're not going to get revenue. If you're a government agency, it might be impacting resident engagement and satisfaction. I could be very frustrated that I need to go down to City Hall to pay a fine just because the website's not accessible for me to be able to do it from home. So those are just a couple of examples of why you should tie it to other business goals, because it makes it that much easier to push it through your organization and also educate other people in your organization. And the last practical tip is, of course, identify a web accessibility champion. We always advocate for that. And I'm sure many of you who are on the line today are web accessibility champions already, but it is really just about staying up to date, both with legislation for your state or your country, if you're in Canada, for example, but also your industry, because in certain states, there have been specific laws passed for specific industries. For example, I know Illinois passed accessibility law specifically to K through 12. You also need to just help your organization just keep track of when you need to make updates and changes, look at internal training and accountability, and then of course also having that transparency across your organization and talking about, hey, these are the key performance indicators, or these are our goals for the upcoming year, and maybe doing a monthly report on how you're progressing on them. And I think I saw someone else drop this in here as well as a tip, is set up realistic goals and milestones. I think that's incredibly important. But yes, one thing is setting up realistic milestones and goals, but another thing is reporting on them throughout the year to make sure that you're making progress. And with that, I'm going to let Ashley go through some of her top accessibility inspiration sources.
Awesome. Yeah, really excited to share these with you guys. These are just some of the people that I follow to, stay inspired and to really kind of understand the importance of accessibility in this space and why it's so necessary. Anna Cook, she's a senior inclusive designer at Microsoft, and she actually has celiac disease, which is a severe autoimmune disorder, and it causes her body to have serious reactions. And she's actually one of 3 million Americans with this disease. So she talks a lot about production design, accessibility, and how that all ties into her being able to maneuver a website. And so it's really inspiring to hear some of the content she has to share. Next, Haven Gurma. She is a disability justice lawyer. She's an author and a speaker. She talks a lot about human rights as well as disability, and she's a tech guru. So very great to follow her and see all of those tips that she's sharing, as well as some of just her great ideas that she puts out there. She's definitely a thought leader. And then Alicia Anderson, she's one of my favorites. We've actually had her as a guest speaker on webinars. Jasmine and I did a webinar earlier this year with her. She is the founder and CEO of the Alicia Anderson Company, and she is an international TEDx speaker, also calls herself an inclusion champion, which she truly is. If you ever get the chance to take a look at, Google her, and you can listen to her TED Talk, I highly encourage you to, because she talks a lot about diversity and inclusion, and she also shares her story. She's a twin, and her twin was born, without the disabilities that she has, and it's just so interesting to hear how she's maneuvered her way to become a successful founder and CEO of a company. And she talks about how important diversity and inclusion is in the workplace. So those are just some of my top 3. But with that, I'll pass it on over to Jasmine to share hers.
Awesome. Thanks, Ash. And I know I follow Alicia's amazing, and I follow Haben as well. So I'll definitely have to follow Anna as well. A couple of the people I really want to recommend is Chris Holloway. He's the accessibility and digital inclusion manager at PwC. If any of you like GIFs or memes or anything funny, he makes accessibility funny. So I definitely recommend you to follow him. It means you get to laugh and learn. What's better than that? Tiffany Yu, she is the CEO of Diversibility, also a TEDx speaker, posts a lot of great little videos and clips about her every day and the importance of diversity. And last but not least, Miriam Nabinger, she is an accessibility consultant, and she also has lots of fantastic and great visual tips of how to tackle not only website, but just digital accessibility in general in your organization. So definitely recommend you to check her out. Ashley,
Awesome.
over to
And then I
you.
will run through, yeah, I will run through some of our amazing blogs and webinars, some of the blog posts from 2022. We did a recap on the IAP position statement and recommendations on accessibility overlay tools. So I mentioned that earlier when I was talking about some of the articles. So that'd be great to revisit. A look at the legal landscape of web accessibility compliance. We also did one on why you should prioritize mobile accessibility in 2022. That one's one of my personal favorites because I'm a mobile girl. I'm always on my phone. So I thought that was really eye-opening to talk about, how websites being accessible is super important because the majority of us are visiting websites from our mobile phones. The 6 accessibility basics behind 97% of website errors. So just taking it kind of back to the basics there and taking a look at that. And then 33 accessibility statistics you need to know in 2022. I highly encourage you guys to take a look at that one if you get the chance to as well. It really is a good buffer as well to kind of what we're doing and talking about here today. And then webinars from 2022, you'll probably see myself and Jasmine on one of these, but preparing for WCAG 2.2, which we talked about is soon to be released here. Intro to Assistive Technology, that one was one of my favorites as well. We hosted a gentleman who talks about, he's an assistive technology consultant and expert. So he talks about, how important it is to have your websites accessible for people who do use assistive technology, as well as goes over the different types of assistive technology, which was really an eye opener for me because I didn't realize how many there were and how many different ways a website can be accessed. And then web accessibility for beginners. If you're new to web accessibility, if you're one of those people who at the beginning of the webinar here voted that you haven't really gotten started yet, that's a great one too, just to talk about, beginner tips and tricks for web accessibility. And then some others we want to offer here is the exclusive interview with accessibility advocate Alicia Anderson. As Jasmine mentioned, her and I are both big fans, and we got the chance to do an exclusive interview with her. So I highly encourage that you check that out. And then some helpful accessibility resources and courses. We had the W3C Web Accessibility Initiative, so you can check that one out. The W3C online course, Introduction to Web Accessibility. I personally did that one last year when I was just kind of getting my toes wet in this space, and it really helped me a lot to understand. So if you're someone who would like to learn more, I highly encourage that one. U.S. Government Section 508. WCAG 2.1 quick reference guide there to get you well versed with 2.1, which is a great idea before we merge on over to 2.2, just to make sure you got everything you need there. And then the international accessibility policies and Moncito's website. Of course, got to talk about our website here because there's so much on there where you can find webinars, resources. We also have some free tools on our website, so please take a look. And as we're talking about some Moncito resources that are on our website, we'll just continue the conversation here and talk about some resources that we recommend to help you get started on your accessibility journey, as well as if you've already started to kind of, help you continue along that journey. The Accessibility Handbook, which is a great resource for all things accessibility, as well as our accessibility checklists, which I think are really great because they are role specific. So if you're a content creator, it's a checklist for you of what you should be focusing on for accessibility. If you're a manager, as well as if you're a designer or a developer, we really break it down as to how your role, can help you and where you should be focusing your accessibility efforts at. As well as some of those free tools that I talked about, we have our accessibility statement generator. So every website needs to and should have an accessibility statement showing that you are working on accessibility, your website is accessible. So if you don't have one of those, I encourage you to use the accessibility statement generator on our website and get one going, as well as our color contrast checkers. So as we talked about, a lot of people do have, visual impairments, and one of those would be being colorblind. And with that, there are certain colors that if you have a background and you have some text on it, it makes it really difficult to see. So the color contrast checker is something that even I use as a marketer when I'm putting content out there, just to make sure that, it's accessible for people who may be colorblind or have any other visual impairments. So definitely encourage you to check that one out. And then also with that, I'm going to allow us to go through the poll.
Awesome. Yeah, so we're, as always, super happy to help. And I'm just going to launch a poll right now. So Moncito's our tool. If you're not familiar with us, we are able to scan your website and help you identify accessibility errors and where you should get started. So we'd love to either help you out with a free scan of your website. Always great, kind of gives you an idea of where you're at and where you can get started. Also seeing a demo of the Moncito accessibility module. That's something that can help you prioritize all of your different issues and errors. If you just want to find out if your website is ADA compliant, we'd love to help out with that, or all of the above. But I think I'm just going to leave this poll open because I know we've got 10 minutes left for Q&A. So I'll leave the poll open, and then I'll let Megan take us into Q&A.
Excellent. So kicking things off, we've had a number of questions come through, but kind of circling back to resources. But if there's anything that you'd like to add in addition, the question, there's a brief intro, but it says, I'm a digital accessibility consultant with no clients. I'm blind and use a screen reader. I also wear hearing aids. How do I get involved with the new WCAG or any newer versions?
Ooh, well, I think if you want to get involved with commenting on the WCAG and commenting on the different versions, we'd be happy to send you a link. I know the W3C, as I mentioned, they're always open to public comment and also other people coming in and helping them test and all of that. So we'd love for you to get involved. So I will definitely make sure that we get you connected with them.
Perfect. All right, then we had another one come in. As a small business, what can we do to measure our website, or excuse me, make sure our website is accessible for all?
That is a really, really great question. I think being a small business, it is more difficult to navigate website accessibility. You don't always have the budget for tools to help you. The good news is there are a lot of website builders nowadays that are improving a lot of key things inside the tool as well, helping to remind you. So I would say as a small business, prioritize the fundamentals. So I would say if you're going to prioritize 3 things, make sure that you have skip to content, which is something, if you watch our web accessibility for beginners webinar, we talk a little bit more about that, but what that means is if you're using keyboard navigation, you can skip directly to the content. The screen reader doesn't read out the menu to you every single time. Focus on alt text, for example, on images, making sure that that's accessible. And then also just making sure that you have, what was I going to say? That you also make sure that PDFs, for example, if you have them on your website, that you're trying to make sure that they're accessible. I know that's a little bit more difficult. So what we, especially for small businesses, what I normally recommend is don't use PDFs. Just put all the information on your website. It makes it that much more accessible for people. So those would be my top tips for a small business. And I will also follow up with our in-house web accessibility consultant tomorrow to see if he has any more awesome tips for small businesses. So keep a lookout for the Q&A and we'll add those in there for you as well.
Excellent. Thank you for that. In addition, we've actually had a couple of people ask similar questions, but what would be top 3 areas / issues to prioritize when looking to improve a website's compliance?
Yeah, that's again, a really great question. I think always start with your homepage, for example, because that is the first place that people land. So if that isn't accessible, you can't even get through. Also think about what is the main call to action or user journey on your website. I think prioritizing that. Essentially, any time that you're working on your website, you should prioritize where you have the most traffic. So if it's the user journey, prioritize where you have most traffic through the flow. If you have PDFs or documents for download on your website, make sure that you're prioritizing the documents that have the most downloads. Then like I mentioned before, just like for small business owners, for medium and big size business owners, make sure you have skip to content enabled. That is something that's incredibly frustrating. Make sure you have proper heading structure on your website. Using a screen reader and trying to navigate through a website is incredibly frustrating if the heading structure is not correct. Another couple very common issues is descriptive link text. So if you have a website and you have calls to action where it says read more, and on all the buttons, what you should ideally have is descriptive link text. So it says read more about Moncito's accessibility module, read more about Moncito's quality assurance module, and then the screen reader will pick those up. So testing that is another important thing. And something we're actually talking about today is captions. Captions are incredibly important as well on video. I know we're using more and more video in our society than ever before. So definitely an advocate for making sure that you're doing that. A lot of video hosting tools today have free captioning. And Ashley, maybe you want to share how we do the captioning on Wistia, right, with our webinars?
Yeah, so we actually use a captioning service, and what we do is, I'm the person who does it. We run them through the captioning service, but we actually have a human touch to it where I go in and I will listen to the webinar and make sure if there's any mistakes. For example, AI doesn't always catch everything. It's pretty funny with Moncito, it always gets caught as something different, like Monsanto, or something different. Sometimes our names get caught as something different. So really adding that human touch and making sure that you guys get the best and clearest captions so that you understand the content.
Yeah, and I think Ashley makes a really good point there, is that the best way to address accessibility, there's no one perfect way, but often it's a combination of automation and human verification. So yes, you can save time and you can make it more scalable by using artificial intelligence, whether it be an AI captioning service, but then going in, actually doing the human work and checking everything afterwards, because it's not perfect, it's not reliant. We take a very similar approach to websites, right? Like we scan the websites and help you identify and find where all the errors are on your website. But we also have a lot of manual checks built into our website to make sure that things are correct. A great example of that is alt text on images. So for example, if I scanned, let's say this slide that we're looking at right now with the giant light bulb picture, let's say we scanned this and it was a website, our tool could help verify that there is an image and it has alt text, but it cannot tell me whether or not that alt text is correct. I could have put in the alt text for this light bulb illustration to be the Moncito logo and said, but that's incorrect. And that's where you need that human verification to go in and update the alt text to something that's correct, which is an illustration of a light bulb, for example.
Excellent. Very important info. Additional question that came in that was a little bit different is, which is better to be single A compliant or triple A compliant?
That's a really great question. So if you're not familiar with WCAG, WCAG has versions, and that's what we've primarily been talking about today. So 2.0, 2.1, and the upcoming 2.2. Each of these also has 3 different levels, if you say, of conformance. A is actually the lowest standard. So A means you're kind of meeting the bare minimum of that version. AA is the most commonly accepted standard, and that's really where you should be aiming to be at. It is often where legislation will reference, for example, to WCAG 2.1 AA standard. The AAA is really the gold standard. Of course, you should work towards it, but it is very difficult to maintain over time, just because as you're having new content being added to your website, you probably will need to update it all the time. So I would say aim for AA, try to go after with like as a cherry on top for those extra AAA standards. But yeah, it goes A, AA, and AAA. And that is something that is consistent for WCAG 2.0, 2.1, and 2.2. It is something that will probably change with 3.0.
Perfect. Thank you. And I know that we are running right at the top of the hour, so we're just about out of time. We do appreciate that everyone did submit some questions, so we'll be following up as well with answers to those questions so that you don't get left hanging. But thank you everyone very much for joining us today. Ton of fantastic information. Thank you, ladies, for introducing me to the market. I'm excited to be a part of the team, and we'll continue to close out the year and then look forward to a fantastic 2023.
Yeah, and just a reminder, we will be sending out the recording and slides, but just give us a day or two, because we do like to, like we talked about, put those alt text on the slides and edit the captions and get that sent out to you. But thank you everyone for joining, and please rest assured that if you signed up for the webinar, you will get a copy of the recording and slides. And we hope you have a great rest of the year, and happy holidays to those who celebrate, and hope to see you next year for some of our webinars.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone.